All right, looks like it is 4 o'clock here in Helsinki. Welcome to FIA and the Center on U.S. Power and Politics Transatlantic Currents event. It's on quality, harassment, and specifically on sexual assault in the U.S. military and the momentum that's building for a stronger policy and some better justice response. I'm Charlie Salonius Pasternak. I'll only speak for another 30 seconds or so, but I'm the head of Center on U.S. Power and Politics. But today's event is actually hosted by Leo Michel. He's one of our dear former visiting fellows here at FIA, and has decades of his experience in the U.S. defense establishment. From admin perspective, please close your cameras, keep them closed. And put all of your questions into the chat. I will then collect them from there. Without further ado, Leo, take it away.
Thanks very much, Charlie, and greetings from Washington. I'd like to take a few minutes just to set the context for this discussion today. Some of you may find this a surprising topic, but it's a very important and very timely one. And you'll see the reasons for that as our discussion progresses. For the context, let me mention a few things. First of all, the Department of Defense is the largest single employer in the United States. Now, when it comes to the military, there are 1.4 million men and women on active duty, and another 1.1 million serve in our National Guard and Reserve Forces. At the same time, Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the power to raise and support armies, provide and maintain a navy, and make rules for the governance of those forces. And it's under this authority that Congress determines the military criminal law that's applicable to members of the armed forces. Both of these institutions are operating at a time of very fast-moving societal changes and in an unprecedented environment of political polarization. Now, in recent decades, the US military has made some significant efforts to become a more inclusive force that better reflects American society, while at the same time improving the skills, the readiness, and the effectiveness of its military units. When the all-volunteer force, military force, was created in 1973, women represented just 8% of the officer corps and 2% of the enlisted ranks. Today, those figures are approximately 19% for the officer corps and 17% for enlisted ranks. And women have served in increasingly challenging and dangerous positions. According to what I found from the Department of Defense, since 2001, over 170 service women have died in the course of operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Hundreds more have been wounded. U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth is one such a veteran. In 2004, then Army Captain Duckworth, a pilot of an assault helicopter, was shot down in Iraq, resulting in the amputation of both of her legs. Now, in 2016, the Pentagon announced that all military occupations and positions will be open to women without exception, including in our elite combat forces. That year, President Obama also appointed a 4-star Air Force General, Lori Robinson, as the first female combatant commander. So during 2016, 2018, she headed the Northern Command, which is responsible for the defense of the US homeland and its air, land, and sea approaches. And President Biden recently nominated female generals to head Southern Command, which covers Central and Latin America, and Transportation Command, which conducts global military operations supporting the other 10 combatant commanders. So 2 of the 11 US combatant commanders, upon their confirmation by the Senate, will be women. Other significant changes have occurred over the past decade. President Obama repealed the so-called "don't ask, don't tell" policy, which had forced gay, lesbian, and bisexual individuals to conceal the sexual orientation. And shortly after his inauguration, President Biden repealed the Trump-era ban on transgender Americans joining the military. But there is definitely another side to this story, and that's the subject of today's webinar. Sexual assault and harassment remain, according to the new Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kathleen Hicks, a, quote, persistent and corrosive problem across the military. Now, in his first official act, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin appointed an independent review commission on sexual assault and harassment to assess the problem and make recommendations to improve the military justice system's handling of those criminal offenses, to prevent such behavior in the first place, and to improve the overall climate and culture of military service. Earlier this month, Army General Mark Milley, who is chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff, publicly acknowledged that, in his words, the huge number of sexual assaults can no longer be tolerated. And he continued, now this is General Milley I'm quoting, quote, the chain of command, we the generals, the colonels, the captains, and so on, we have lost the trust and confidence of our subordinates and our ability to deal with sexual assault. We need to make a change, unquote. When you think of it, that is a pretty stunning admission. Now, to discuss the subject in greater detail, I am delighted to welcome two guest speakers. Dr. Corinne Faris is a senior behavioral scientist at the RAND Corporation, focusing on the measurement and prevention of military sexual assault, sexual harassment, and intimate partner violence. Ms. Adelaide Khan is the Director of Programs and Policy at Protect Our Defenders, POD as it's referred to, a national human rights organization dedicated to ending sexual violence, victim retaliation, misogyny, and racism in the military. I will take about 15 minutes with each of our guests, beginning with Dr. Faris, to discuss their work on these issues, and that will leave ample time for questions from our webinar audience to be submitted through the chat function. Dr. Faris, good morning. I wonder if you could we could begin with a brief discussion of the RAND Corporation. Why was it selected to do the 2014 military workplace study in the first place, since the Department of Defense had previously conducted surveys of its own?
Sure. Well, let me just thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here to talk with you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. So as to the institution, RAND is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization, and our goal is really to assist decision makers to make evidence-based policy decisions. We have about 1,800 staff members, about half with doctorates, spanning 350 different academic disciplines, and that allows us to construct diverse research teams, which I think helps to provide the best possible research designs. I think really based on the hard work of my colleagues and RAND leadership, both present as well as past, we've built a reputation for being objective and free of partisan bias, and I think that's how this particular contract came to RAND. So as you mentioned, DoD has been conducting its own surveys assessing what they call unwanted sexual contact since 1996. In the most recent one, before we took the survey for a year in 2014, they had estimated that 26,000 service members had had an experience with unwanted sexual contact in the past year. And in 2013, I think there was 14, I'm sorry, as there had been for a few years before, there was really widespread public attention and concern, both by, in press reports, in congressional inquiries. And there started to be questions about the validity of the estimate. People wondered, what was this construct, unwanted sexual contact? What did it include? What did it mean? Had the survey been constructed properly? Those concerns about quality were were by and large unfounded. The DoD Internal Office conducts pretty high quality studies that are consistent with industry standards. But because of the questions, because of the concerns, some members of Congress really urged that they take that outside to an independent organization. And so they selected RAND to do that work, specifically to redesign the approach used to measure sexual assault, so it was more clear what was being measured, what exact crimes or policy violations were being measured. And so we were able to take that on to do a pretty significant redesign, and we fielded it, as I said, in 2014.
So could you, for a layperson, describe some of the key elements of that methodology, how you formulated the questions, the definitions that you used, how was knowledge of the survey advertised and distributed to members of the military force to ensure broad participation? I'm sure many of them were concerned that their answers also would be confidential. And say something about the number of respondents that you had, please.
Sure. So we took a new approach to measurements. The work that had been done in the past was consistent with civilian measures, but it was largely a psychological measure. It was measuring, behaviors from sexual harassment through sexual coercion to sexual assault, and so it wasn't always entirely clear: are these all people who experienced for whom a crime had been committed against them, or for whom a policy violation had committed? And the decision makers that were using this data, they weren't academics. They didn't need that continuous measure. What they needed to know is yes or no, did a crime happen? Yes or no, was there a policy violation? And so we used as our definition the criteria in the Uniform Code of Military Justice for sexual assault, and then also policy definitions of sexual harassment. Now, of course, you can't have a survey that has 1.5 pages of legalese from the Uniform Code of Military Justice and say, did this happen to you? And so we designed it first with a series of very behaviorally specific screening questions about the kinds of acts that might have happened. We were very careful to avoid the word sex or sexual, because for male victims, the events often don't have a sexual context. They're happening in hazing situations in which they meet the definition in terms of contact and penetration, but nobody's having sex, so to speak. We were trying to improve measurement for men. And then, fortunately, the UCMJ has very clean behavioral definitions of what offender behaviors constitute sexual assault. And so what we were able to do is, for those people who said that they had had certain specific acts happen to them non-consensually, we then were able to measure, how did that happen, including all of the offender behaviors that meet DoD criteria, as well as some that don't necessarily meet criteria. And then we were able to categorize people as either experiencing sexual assault or not, sexual harassment or not, even if maybe they themselves didn't necessarily use those words. And what we were really hoping to do is have some of the questions about measurement fade away, so that we could say, in the end, this is the number that draws on your definition. If the person was telling the truth on the survey, which we expect service members to do, then everything is here to constitute that kind of event. Congress had already stipulated the sample, so the survey went out to all active duty women as well as a quarter of active duty men. And so that was nearly 500,000 people who were asked to participate. We received responses from about 145,000 people, or 30% of respondents. 30% of the people who were invited. And then we did survey weighting techniques that allow you, so some people are more likely to take surveys than others. And if you don't account for that, you can get some bias in your estimates. So we used survey weighting techniques to make sure that the sample was generalizable to the full sample of active duty service members.
One quick question. Was this a written survey, a piece of paper, or did you conduct this electronically?
It was initially electronically, so people were invited by email to participate with several reminders. However, those who didn't respond in that way were also phoned to do phone interviews and also received paper copies.
So I wanted now really to come in a way to the heart of the matter. In this, and by the way, later on during the program, I will post in the chat function for our listeners the link so that people can read this study and some of the subsequent studies for themselves. How would you summarize the key findings of that 2014 study, the estimates and the associated confidence level of actual occurrence of sexual assault and harassment versus reported numbers, and the number of estimated victims as a percent of the active duty force, and maybe any observations you'd like to add on the kind of the distribution of occurrences according to factors such as the rank and the branch of the military service. That's a lot, I know, in one thing.
I'll try to remember it all. So what we found is that we estimated that 1% of servicemen had been sexually assaulted in the past year, and that 4.9% of service women had been sexually assaulted in the past year. The sample, as I mentioned, was very, very large, and that means our confidence intervals were pretty tight. Less than, I think, 0.25% for men, about that, about 0.25% around the 4.6% estimate for women. So we're pretty confident that those numbers are as they seem. We estimated that 20,000 service members total had been sexually assaulted just in that past year. One interesting finding that came out of it is that, as you mentioned, there's a gender imbalance in the American military. There are more men than women. And what that means is that even though men are at lower risk for sexual assault than women, when you calculate it out by the population size, about half of sexual assault victims in the military are men and about half are women. And so that's an important consideration when you think about prevention. So a lot of prevention and response efforts have this assumption that victims are women, when in fact in the military, a good portion of the victims are in fact men. It was the first time that I think anybody had a large enough sample of men who had been assaulted to be able to describe how those incidents differed from assaults against women, and they were significantly different. So men who had been assaulted were more likely to be assaulted repeatedly in that past year. They were more likely to be assaulted by multiple offenders relative to a single offender. Their assaults were more likely to involve injuries, threats of violence. And for many, they described it as happening as part of a hazing incident, which is what I had sort of described before. So a group of colleagues attacking an individual. So I think we think about sexual assault as a brutal crime for good reason. But what we learned from this study is that the sexual assaults against men may be even more brutal.
Did you make an estimate as well of sexual harassment? Because under parts of the military code of justice, that can also be criminal.
Sure. Yes, we did. And those numbers are much larger. So 26% of women in the service had been sexually harassed. We categorized as having been sexually harassed according to policy definitions just in that past year, and the number was about 7% for men. And the risk factors for sexual harassment are very similar to sexual assault. They're younger folks, unmarried folks, junior enlisted service members relative to more senior folks.
So Rand, you and personally and Rand did some subsequent reports since 2014, and you looked at, I believe, at how assault and harassment affected separations from the military, correlations between assault harassment and the broader workplace, and the incidence of retaliation, which could take many forms, to those who dare to share information on an assault or harassment occurrence that's taken place. We only have a couple minutes left before we're going to shift, but can you just mention some of those important phenomena as well?
Sure. Yeah, so in the original report, we had found, in terms of retention and separation, we had found that many victims said that they were very unlikely to remain in the service. About 23% said they were very unlikely, which was about double non-victims, who were 11%. So we definitely had reason to believe that these events were leading to retention problems. The problem is that people's self-report on employment decisions are notoriously unreliable. So we really wanted to know, we wanted to follow them over time to look at their real world separation decisions. And so we had to wait, but we did do a follow-up survey. DoD keeps very careful and good employment records, so we were able to link that to the survey to try to understand, do people indeed leave the service at higher rates? And we found for folks who had been sexually assaulted in the previous year that they were 2 times more likely to separate than those who had not. And this, for sexual harassment, 1.7 times more likely to separate. Of course, you kind of wonder, well, wouldn't many of those people have separated anyways? And yes, that is true. And many people would have separated whether or not they had been sexually assaulted. But what we estimated is that there were additional 2,000 people who separated due to a sexual assault who would not otherwise have separated relative to baseline estimates. And then for sexual harassment, that's a much larger percentage. And so even though the effect is a little bit smaller, we predicted that there were 8,000 additional separations of sexually harassed service members relative to those who had not been harassed. So certainly there's a social good to thinking about preventing sexual assault, preventing sexual harassment. There's a legal requirement to do those things. But I think what this study showed is that there's also a readiness element to it in terms of people leaving who might not otherwise have left. We did take a look at whether these separations were voluntary or involuntary. And most of them are voluntary. And what that means is that these are people who the military would have preferred to stay, who were performing well, who could have continued to serve in this position, but who chose not to. And those are big losses and have costs associated with them.
And just in the sentence or two, is a fear of retaliation a significant factor among those who have suffered either sexual assault or sexual harassment?
Absolutely. And for good reason, because people who are sexually assaulted or harassed do get retaliated against. And so people know that that's probably going to happen based on what they've observed. And so many of them choose that, the costs associated with reporting don't outweigh the benefits.
Okay. Thanks very much. And then we'll come back to this. I'm sure our audience is going to have some more questions. Adelaide Khan, if we may turn to you, could you give us also a brief description of your organization, Protect Our Defenders? What's its mission, its major accomplishments? And very quickly, since you're a non-government organization, how are you funded?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me as well. It's an honor to be here this morning. So I am the Director of Programs and Policy at Protect Our Defenders, and Protect Our Defenders, as you mentioned at the beginning, we're a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to ending sexual violence, victim retaliation, misogyny, sexual prejudice, and racism in the military and combating a culture that has allowed it to persist. I realize that's a bit of a mouthful, and we're kind of tackling a lot of issues in kind of one organization, but we were founded in 2011. Basically, when the founder of the organization was working with a congresswoman in Northern California, Representative Jackie Speier, who was receiving a lot of constituent complaints related to issues surrounding military sexual assault, which at that point in time was a very quiet issue, which interestingly enough was 2 years before the time period that Corinne was describing, basically in 2013, 2014, when there was a lot of media attention and subsequent reform. So as a nonprofit organization, we're 501c3. We are not government. We're not funded by the government. We're funded largely by private donations, the generosity of foundational grants, and some that we apply to and some that we were given, but mostly from the generosity of private citizens. So yeah.
This is kind of broad brush, but when you look back, let's say over the past decade, how would you evaluate the Department of Defense record and congressional legislation, because some has been passed during that period, to identify, to prevent, and or respond to the phenomena of sexual assault and harassment? Have things evolved in a positive but slow evolution, or have you found over that decade a lot of resistance? And then I'm going to ask you what's caused for the change, but just look back a little bit and how is this issue? It's been simmering for some time. How has it grown?
Yeah, so as mentioned, there were a lot of significant reforms borne out a little bit less than a decade ago, in response to the Rand report, and in particular, a high-profile case that our president Don Christensen was involved with, which involved a high-level officer who was convicted of sexual assault, whose conviction was overturned by a general officer who, because he was a good soldier. And that led to a huge outcry that resulted in what's known as Article 60 reform, basically taking away that power from the commander to overturn a conviction for any reason or no reason at all. And there's been a number of other really significant reforms, including enhancements to victims' rights, the expansion of the Special Victims Counsel and Victims Legal Counsel programs that are basically attorneys that are afforded to victims of sexual assault who qualify, basically what's known as a DoD ID card holder. So either an active duty service member, veteran, or dependent. But one of the significant issues that our organization feels we've been focusing on for almost a decade, that we feel would really contribute to significant reform, and there's been huge resistance within the DoD and a large number of congressional members, is removing the prosecutorial authority from commanders. So this is not unique. There are actually quite a few military systems around the world that have either used to do this or continue to do this, where basically a commander who oversees all of the workings of an entire unit or an entire battalion also has the ability to determine whether charges are going to be preferred against an individual who maybe have an accusation of sexual assault against them. So what that means in layman's terms is that the evidence is presented to them in the same way it would be to a prosecution team or a district attorney in the U.S. And a determination is then made whether this is a case that should go to trial or not. And this is something that our organization feels would make a really big difference in the lives of victims who are coming forward to report their sexual assaults, because in large part due to what Corinne was mentioning is retaliation is such a huge deterrent for folks to come forward and reporting sexual assaults. And that is in large part because the person who's ultimately going to be making the decision whether or not to prosecute is in their chain of command. And so it's a significant factor that we believe can be overcome if this power is taken away.
So your organization, not to mention a few, and I think until recently it's been only a few, but very prominent members of Congress. I'm thinking of Senator Gillibrand from New York. They've been calling attention to this, but it's only really been, it seems to me, in recent months that you've had a real upsurge of interest to reconsider that approach. Could you explain, because I mean, you're an activist, you're an advocate in this area, what's caused this change? I know there was a brutal murder by another soldier of a young Army private, Vanessa Guillen, in April 2020, I believe. She had told her family that she had been sexually harassed along with other female soldiers by an unnamed sergeant, but all of those complaints were dismissed. And following an investigation, I believe there were something like at least a dozen senior officers relieved of duty for leadership failures in connection with their failure to prevent that crime or prevent crimes related to sexual assault and sexual harassment in units under their command. But what's really shifted the ground? For those who haven't been following this in Finland, I mean, we've seen now this very, very strange coalition of some people from the very right wing of the Republican Party now joining with Senator Gillibrand and other, I'd say, moderate to progressive Democrats on legislation to change some of this.
Yeah, so you're right to bring up Vanessa Guillen's tragic murder. I would say, so to back up, and a lot of this is probably not new information to anybody, given 2020 was such a bizarre year in so many regards. But similar to and obviously there's in the U.S. there's been a lot of fomenting over police brutality, but similar to the murder of George Floyd. Vanessa Guillen's murder, which the murder element of it is significant, but what she was experiencing is not unique at all. And she didn't feel comfortable reporting because she didn't feel that her complaints were going to be taken seriously, and she didn't feel that there was going to be accountability held towards her perpetrator, and she feared retaliation. So none of that is unique, unfortunately. But I think what sort of led to her case getting elevated to the status that it became, which was literally it was everywhere. It was national news on the, like I said, kind of the George Floyd of the military, and I think it was because there was a captive audience. You know, social media has come a long way in terms of allowing these stories to be told. I will just also add that in the military, active duty service members are limited in how much they can share publicly about the system that they are under, you know, the systems they're the part of, what they're going through, because not only because they fear retaliation, but because they're also limited literally in what they can say about their circumstances. And so when Me Too kind of surged a couple of years ago, the kind of the Me Too military equivalent didn't really take off very well, or very much, because in my opinion, it wasn't the right time, or there wasn't enough sort of courage, and I say that term not to discount the courageousness that it's taken so many individuals to come forward publicly, but basically it wasn't the right time for the military to have its Me Too moment. And I think last year was really a watershed moment because there was a captive audience. There was all of this attention towards different systems that were oppressing people, and a change in administration. There was an election building up. There was a ton of attention on all of these social issues. I mean, it's being a U.S. citizen living in the U.S., especially in Washington, D.C. this last year, it's just unbelievable. But anyway, so the point is that it was just sort of all of these things kind of coalescing at once. I think what's also important to note is that this issue, even from the beginning, when our organization kicked off, a lot of attention started being paid to sexual assault in the military in the early 2010s. It's always been a bipartisan issue, and it's unique in that sense that there's always been support for reform on both the left and the right, and that's never it's never wavered in that sense. Now, I would say that what's unique about this time around as well is that this is the first time that we've had a commander-in-chief who has vocalized support for reform, or at least taking a look at the issues more so than any other commander-in-chief before. And so I think it's a combination of all of those different elements.
Elections have consequences, as people like to
yes.
say. Let me just, you've already touched upon, one of the most important issues, the transferring from the commander's discretion, his ability to have the disposition of a specific case, and giving that authority to a trained and unbiased military prosecutor. And that, as I understand it, is one of the key elements of the new legislation. You've touched upon that, but you also mentioned other countries. And before we turn to the general audience, I wonder if you would just could say a few words about interaction that you or your organization may have had with other militaries on similar questions. I'm thinking of close allies like Canada and the UK, but I understand that you may have had some contact with the Polish military and perhaps others on these issues as well. What have you learned from them?
Yeah, so in the course of working with Protect Our Defenders, I've had the pleasure of meeting and talking with and getting to know either advocates in other countries or meeting directly with active duty service members in other countries. So in particular, Canada, Poland, and the UK. With regard to the Canadian, we actually a couple of, I guess it was in 2018, we had the pleasure of meeting with several members of the Canadian Forces to sort of talk about different areas of our sort of where we might overlap and where we might learn from each other. And that was a great experience. But more recently, I met with advocates in both the UK and Poland to sort of learn a little bit about the systems in place for victims in both with regard to military sexual assault and all of these systems. And it was really very eye-opening. I would say that in the UK, without going into too many details, there were some things that they obviously did better than us, but at the same time, it was very eye-opening to learn, how few victims' rights there were in comparison, and especially when we were meeting with the advocates from Poland, it was really quite mind-boggling to learn how few basically there are no resources available for victims to come forward, and so there's very much a culture of silence. And so I think what we certainly have a very a system that is not perfect by any means, but I think what it sort of highlighted for us is that we have all of these different entities such as RAND, which I meant to add at the beginning. What's really great is that RAND comes with these great reports, and then we're the voices who are like on the Hill going, you need to pay attention to these numbers. These are very serious. We go to the media and all this stuff. So we kind of work not necessarily hand in hand with RAND, but like we sort of help propel these important data points forward, and we keep kind of the momentum going. So anyway, yeah, all these systems in place that we have are flawed, but we have room for improvement, but they're there.
Thank you. And you have to do a study to know if you have, well,
yes, exactly.
So now I'm going to be quiet, turn this back over to Charlie. I see in the chat there are already several questions coming up. Thank you both for your presentations, and I'll be back at the end to give you a formal wave off. Thank you. Charlie, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you to all three of you for a brilliant beginning to this. Yes, we have some questions here already, and you can read them, but I'll read them out. Is there any data on whether LGB and service members are at particular risk of sexual harassment or violence? And then the second question has to do with international operations. Are service members at more risk serving abroad versus based in the US? And I'll add to this, the RAND report also noted recently the role of alcohol. Now remember, ISAF HQ was dry, but charitably, let's say not every base in Afghanistan was dry. So do you find this also plays a role in operations abroad? Start with those.
Sure. So as to the LGBT question, in 2014, when we fielded the survey, we pushed very strongly to be able to include that question to assess risk. We were not permitted to do so. No military survey at the time was permitted to do so. That has changed. And so in the last couple of surveys that the DoD implemented, there is an assessment of LGBT status, and the numbers are staggering. I can't, I don't want to quote a number off the top of my head because it may not be exactly right, but it is available from the Office of People Analytics. There's a chapter in their 2016 report specifically on LGBT folks. You know, one of the things, it's not included in the chapter, but you can calculate it from the numbers that are in the chapter that we found incredibly important, is that about half of the sexual assaults are that are happening in the military are being targeted against members of the LGBT community. And so that really says something about, you know, how you think about response and prevention, and it's not part of prevention efforts right now. And so we need to be thinking about some of these events as hate crimes potentially, or at least to sort of learn more about them. The other question you had, alcohol.
So, international operations also.
Oh, international operations. So that I'm less clear about. So when we surveyed in 2014, we were drawing down. We had already pretty significantly drawn down from OEA, OEF and OIF. And so there weren't as many deployments. We didn't find a strong association there, if I remember right. But we also didn't have a lot of as many folks deployed, or especially deployed to sort of combat settings. So I'm afraid I can't answer that question precisely. The alcohol question, I think about 30% of sexual assaults involve alcohol in the military, more for women than for men. And that's less than in the civilian world. So I would say in civilian settings, there's sort of this prototypical sexual assault, which is, a romantic or dating situation, alcohol involved, a private setting like the victim or the perpetrator's apartment. In the military, the prototypical assault looks a lot different. It's more something that's happening in the workplace, that's hazing related, that's perpetrated by colleagues, not in a romantic context. And so most of those sexual assaults don't involve alcohol. So I would say I actually am very interested in the connection between alcohol and sexual assault. But for the military, I think that has to be part of the solution. It does constitute a good proportion of the assaults, but it can't be the whole solution because it wouldn't capture many.
Okay, thank you. There's a question also about whether or not you know, or you've maybe worked together in advocacy of how the issue is handled in the Israeli Defense Forces, where women are obliged to serve as opposed to being volunteers, and if that makes a difference.
Yeah, the Israeli Defense Forces is actually a really great example of a justice system that took that command authority out of the chain of command and gave it to independent military prosecutors, or has that outside of that chain of command. There is testimony that was given. If you want, I can find a link to that later. But they testified that it had improved the systems for reporting, and that they were noticing that in general it was helpful. My personal take is that, and I could be off base, but having worked in this issue for a long time, I think that in a system that compels you to service, that you know, the Israelis have probably had to confront this in a better way than we have. We have a volunteer force, and so you know, people can choose whether or not to enlist or commission. And so I would imagine that if it was something that was compelled, that there would be kind of a greater need to address this much more quickly and efficiently.
Thank you. Next question, with the positive trends now, how confident are you that there will be real change in dealing with the problem this time, or at least some of the problems, I guess?
I mean, I would say I'm cautiously optimistic. I think that we have so much momentum right now. It's hard to imagine something not happening. But we have to kind of wait and see. I think as well, in addition to the reform that I was talking about, what another outcome of the Vanessa Guillen murder was that there was a congressionally mandated Fort Hood investigation, which was basically exceptionally revealing, but not necessarily unique to the military base that it was investigating, or that was under investigation. And I think what it revealed is that there are a lot of elements that are also in need of major reform, such as training investigators to be able to properly investigate cases, so that when they are presented for preferral of charges, they are strong cases and they're thoroughly investigated, and there isn't kind of any evidence or chain of evidence that has been tainted. So there are things that I think are tangential, or at least achievable, once we sort of overcome this major kind of significant hurdle. It's been in the works for a long time.
Okay. Well, we have a new question here. Let me ask mine so I can actually time to read this. It's about the methodology. Do you have some thoughts on, you described a little bit on how to do this right? I asked because in Finland, a anonymous whistleblower channel was trialed. Not a lot of people used it, and it's a little unclear why not. But one speculation has been that you had to log in with your own credentials. So therefore, in theory, someone could easily find out who it was, of course. But do you have any advice on how to do surveys like this right, about whatever things an organization wants to find out about, but people might be leery of talking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we faced the same thing with respect to our survey, and people feeling like their CAC, because that was in the computer, it was going to be traced. I think it does not always have to be the case, but it really does help if the organization conducting the study is independent. And so we did a lot of work to sort of push out this notion that, this is, your commander can't get their hands on this. We will never report out an individual's data. We will only provide aggregate data. We had very strong security safeguards and strong MOUs with the Department of Defense that they would never ask for the data. That said, their internal survey department has also been able to do this. And I think part of it is putting the policy requirements in place that will protect that data through transitions in leadership. Because this happens all of the time. You have you have a commander, early command, not a large command, who finds out that there's been a sexual assault, and they immediately want to look at that data. They want to know who it was. They want to be able to go talk to them, drill in, fix the problem. But as soon as you break that confidentiality, you've essentially broken your entire survey system. You've broken that vehicle that people can tell you about things in confidence. So I would say it really comes down to keeping people's confidence and being able to assure them that you will keep that confidence, because that's even if you absolutely plan to do it, there still can be this perception that you won't, or that there's a possibility that you wouldn't. So I think that's the key thing. I think it also helped that we were a research organization and governed by research ethics, and so we explained all of that in our informed consent. Those would be starters, at least.
Thank you. Question here is, can policies addressing sexual assault in the U.S. military be truly effective without acknowledging and/or dismantling the culture of hegemonic militarized masculinities within the institution?
Great question. That's a really, really great question, and I think that's sort of the $1 million question, because that is it is so much a part of not only military culture, but it's sort of been emphasized by pop culture with relation to the military. I mean, any kind of movie from the 80s, 90s, or even earlier, where there was focus on the military, there's that element has been enhanced and almost kind of exonerated, or not exonerated, but amplified. And I think that organizations like ourselves, but also many other organizations, are really trying to take a hard look, and also address the misogynistic culture. And in some ways, that's already being addressed by Congress as well. So, for instance, revenge porn was criminalized, where that basically came out of a Facebook group that was posting pictures, exploitative images of women without their consent, and that was revealed to be occurring. And also, interestingly enough, involved the royal forces in the UK, and so there was a revenge porn law that was passed by Congress in response to that. I think one of the things that Representative Jackie Speer is trying to do with her I Am Vanessa Guillen Act is to also impose more punitive actions against folks who are perpetrating sexual harassment, which would attack the issue of sexual harassment in the workplace, and kind of wraps around that kind of big culture issue. And I think because more and more women are entering the force, there are starting to be shifts in the language that's used and that culture that's perpetuated. But there's certainly, especially amongst the elite forces like the special forces, Navy SEALs, where there's a very big emphasis on misogynistic culture, and there's a long uphill battle that we're only just beginning to sort of tackle.
Looks like we have about 7 minutes to go. No more questions, but to give Leo and both Emily and Corinne some time to give last comments, I want to have one question. Removing prosecutorial power of command, well, that doesn't as such exist in Finland. But there are some efforts to go in the other direction in terms of giving effectively defense command more power over at least seeing what has happened. Do you have any advice or thoughts about this? Is it better to just always keep it civilian, or are there arguments? What are the U.S. military's arguments why kind of the military and not the justice system should have this power?
So just to so what we're advocating for is to keep it still within the military. We're not advocating to remove it entirely. We would just like to see that these decisions are being made by trained independent military prosecutors. So those who are, we're not necessarily advocating to remove it completely and put it, for instance, under the umbrella of the Department of Justice or the DOJ. So it would still, and I think that's been one of the predominant arguments on the opposing side, is that this would, taking this process out would disrupt good order and discipline is the main argument. So if I'm understanding correctly, I think you're suggesting that it would kind of be similar, correct? That it would move it to a different, outside of the chain of command, but would still keep it within the military. Is that correct? Or did I misunderstand?
It is. Of course, there are things which go directly to the police or the prosecutor, where the military doesn't kind of get to choose. But anyway, maybe that's a discussion for another day. But thank you. I was guessing that kind of disrupting the chain of command was going to be one of the arguments about this. But enough me. Who wants to start first? Any last thoughts, comments? Leo, do you want to start?
Yeah, if I may, just to come back to the quote I mentioned before from General Milley, the current head of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's also notable that one of his predecessors, highly respected predecessor, Admiral Mullen, retired Admiral Mullen, has essentially said the same thing. And they've said this in the wake of an initial report from this independent commission set up by the new Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, to do this review and report the recommendations within 90 days. And this is, I don't believe the full report now has been issued, but the commission, the independent commission, felt strongly enough about this issue of changing the prosecutorial responsibilities that they've already made a statement on that. And it's important. It's a really important reversal for the military that you have the chairman now that comes out and says publicly, I'm open to this. Because as I mentioned before, he says, we have failed. And important voices, not only the current Deputy Secretary of Defense, the first woman to occupy that position, Kathleen Hicks, but a predecessor, Michelle Flournoy, who was the third highest ranking official in the Department of Defense under President Obama, said essentially the same thing a couple of months ago. And just said, we failed, and so we have to do something differently. I wanted to thank both of our presenters for this. As I mentioned, it's for some in the audience, it may be a surprising topic, but on the other hand, it's not. It brings together the kind of the interface of what's happening in one of the most important and frankly, still one of the most highly respected institutions in the United States, the US military. It brings together these dynamics that are changing in society. Thankfully, I would add, as after too much time where they've been ignored or minimized, and also the time where the political dynamics have shifted in important ways, at least on this issue, and let's hope that maybe a little less polarization in the future. So I think maybe we'll just close there. I'll say to the broader audience that check the FIA website. We'll be advertising through there if there is a June session of the webinar. But if I could ask all of you to join me in a virtual round of applause for our two panelists, and thank you, Charlie and Tafia, for hosting this episode of Transatlantic Currents.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.